My son treated me like the servant. So I sold the house and took every penny. The result is, the soup was still hot. That's what I remember most clearly. The steam curled like memory from the pot I'd left simmering since morning lentils, a touch of rosemary, and those sweet carrots my grandkids used to love. I stirred it absent-mindedly, even though I knew no one would come to eat it. The table was set for 5, but 4 of those chairs stayed empty. Again, I'm Elaine, 70 years old this past spring, born and raised right here in Springfield, Missouri. This house, well, it's the only one I've ever called mine. My late husband Richard built half of it with his own hands back when sweat meant something, and neighbors came over with pies, not judgments. We raised our son Greg here, and for a while it was full of noise and joy and chaos. Now it's just me and the soup. It wasn't supposed to be like this. After Richard passed, Greg said I shouldn't live alone. Said it wasn't safe that family sticks together. He and his wife Tanya had just lost their house after Greg got laid off, so we agreed he'd move back home with the kids, just until things stabilized. That was 5 years ago. At first it felt nice, the laughter of children echoing through these walls, again little feet, pattering down the hallway like wind chimes in summer. I gave them the master bedroom. I didn't mind, really, I didn't. I just wanted them to be okay. I thought I was giving them comfort, a restart, a future. But little by little things changed. It was Tanya who stopped calling me Mom first. Then it was the way Greg started talking to me, not with love, but with instruction. Could you fold the laundry, pick up the kids from school? Did you finish the dishes? And always followed by, thanks, you're a lifesaver. That last part always stung more than it should have. I didn't want to be a lifesaver. I wanted to be a mother, a grandmother, family. But the roles shifted. I just didn't realize how much until the day I overheard Tanya laughing on the phone in the hallway. She does everything for us, she giggled. It's like having live-in help, except free. I stood frozen at the corner of the kitchen, holding Greg's dirty socks in my hands. My ears burned, my eyes blurred. And the next thing I knew, I was back at the stove stirring soup I didn't want to eat. I didn't say anything that night, or the next. I just kept doing what I always did, folding the towels just the way Tanya liked them, putting away the groceries, sweeping the floors before they woke up. I kept telling myself, it's family, it'll pass, they're stressed, they'll remember. But as the months passed, I realized something chilling. They didn't forget who I was, they had rewritten it. Greg barely looked me in the eye anymore. Tanya started leaving sticky notes on the fridge, milk low. More eggs, pick up dry cleaning, no please, no thank you. And the kids. They still hugged me, bless their hearts. But even they began to parrot things. Grandma, don't sit there, that's Dad's chair. Or worse, Mom says, you don't know how to use the tablet. Sometimes I wonder if this is how it begins, not with shouting, but with silence. Not with a slammed door, but with a slow erasure of your place in the room. That night I placed 5 bowls of soup on the table. Mine, Greg's, Tanya's, and the kids. I sat at my usual spot by the window and waited. No one came down. Eventually, I tiptoed up the stairs and heard them laughing in the bedroom, all cuddled up with takeout and a movie. I sat back down at the table, the candle flickering low beside my untouched bowl, and tried not to cry. But tears came anyway. Hot, quiet ones, the kind you cry alone. Because if someone saw, they'd tell you you're being too sensitive. I reached for Richard's photo in the hallway and held it close to my chest. You wouldn't have let this happen, I whispered. You never made me feel small. I wish I knew when I disappeared from this house, when love turned into labor, when my voice stopped mattering. But more than that, I wish I knew how to come back from it. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, how would you handle it? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, if you could call the pull-out sofa in the den, a bed watching the ceiling fan spin slowly, casting shadows like clock hands on the walls. The sounds of the house were muffled, but I could still hear faint laughter upstairs. Greg's voice, Tanya's giggle, a child, squealing at some cartoon. Their world, not mine. That bed used to be in the guest room, my room. But after their second baby, I was temporarily relocated to make space. I'd said yes, of course, because that's what you do for family, isn't it? It was only supposed to be for a few months. Then months became years. I kept thinking about Richard, about how we'd planned to grow old here together. He used to joke that he'd never leave this house unless it was in a pine box. He never got that far, his heart gave out while he was fixing the garden gate. Just like that, I was alone. Or at least I thought I was until Greg offered to move in. But now, lying under a thin blanket in a room that once stored Christmas decorations, I realized I was lonelier than ever. The next morning, I made breakfast for everyone. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. I left it all on the counter, neatly arranged like always. Tanya passed by in her workout clothes, barely glancing at the food. Greg came down and grabbed a piece of toast without a word. Morning, I offered softly. He nodded, chewing, already scrolling on his phone. Later that afternoon, I was folding laundry when Tanya walked into the laundry room holding a blouse. "Did you use the gentle cycle?" she asked, holding it up. I did. "Why?" "It shrank. You probably didn't do it right." I opened my mouth to explain, to say that it was the same setting I always used, that maybe the fabric. "Never mind," she said sharply, "just be more careful." She turned and left. I stared at the blouse in her hand, feeling smaller than the fabric in her grip. That night I watched as Tanya posted a family photo on Facebook. Greg, her, the kids, all smiles on the porch. My porch. The caption read, "Grateful for our home and this little family of ours." No mention of me, no sign I was even part of it. I stared at that photo for a long time. The front door behind them had the wreath I made last Christmas. The swing Greg was sitting on, Richard built it the summer before his death. Even the dog in the corner had been mine before Tanya decided it should bond better with the kids. I don't know what snapped in me, but something did. I walked into my old bedroom, now their nursery, and looked around. My mother's quilt, once folded on the foot of my bed, was being used as a playmat. The rocking chair Richard bought me when Greg was born sat in the corner stuffed with toys. My memories had become their furniture. I stood in that doorway for a long time before quietly shutting the door. That night, I opened the cabinet under the stairs where Richard used to keep the house papers. He always believed in doing things the old-fashioned way, printed documents folders, hard copies. That's how I found the envelope. Inside was the original title deed, and tucked behind it a folded sheet of paper in Richard's handwriting. A letter, a clause, something I'd forgotten or maybe never truly understood at the time. It said, in the event that the property should ever be cohabited by a relative under duress or hardship, legal ownership shall remain solely with Elaine, my wife, unless changed by formal notarized agreement. My hands trembled. I read the sentence again and again. The house was still mine, all of it. They'd moved in, they'd taken over, but I had never signed it away, not truly. The clause Richard had included, the clause I hadn't thought twice about, was my quiet key. That night, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself a thought I'd buried deep beneath years of sacrifice. What if I took it back? What if I stopped apologizing for needing space in my own home? What if I sold it? What if I left? I didn't know if it was bitterness or bravery, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I didn't want to. So I sat down at the kitchen table, lit a single candle, and opened my laptop. I searched local estate lawyers. My hand hovered above the keyboard before I typed in my name, Elaine Whitman, 70, Springfield, Missouri. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something like hope. If you had the chance to quietly take your life back, would you, The lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper. It was a modest building tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered diner, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice unless you were desperate or determined. I was both. I'd called ahead and made an appointment under my maiden name, Elaine Morris, just in case Tanya ever thought to snoop through the caller ID. Paranoid, maybe. But after years of feeling invisible, you learn how to protect the last pieces of yourself. The receptionist looked young enough to be my granddaughter, but she greeted me with kindness, not impatience. That alone almost made me cry. "Mr. Henley will be with you shortly, Mrs. Morris," she said. Mr. Henley looked like someone who had been through a few hard winters himself. Late 60s slow-moving glasses low on his nose. I liked him immediately. "I've reviewed the documents you sent, ma'am," he said, after I sat down. "And I've got to say, your late husband was a very careful man." He tapped a legal pad with a yellow pencil. "That closet holds up, clear as daylight, unless you've signed any formal agreements relinquishing ownership since." "I haven't," I said quietly. "They just moved in." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "Well then, legally this house is still yours, Mrs. Whitman. Every shingle of it." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We talked through options. I told him everything, not the emotion, just the facts. But he could read between the lines. The piles of laundry, the lack of a bedroom, the silence at the dinner table. "You have the right," he said. "More than the right, you have the power." That word power sent a chill through me. When I walked out of the office, the sky was pale blue and cloudless. I stopped by a bakery and bought myself a scone. Just for me, no one else. I ate it on a park bench watching ducks float past. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I just was. When I got home, Greg was standing in the kitchen eating chips out of the bag. He barely looked up. "Hey, Mom, you get the dry cleaning." I looked at him. "No," I said. He turned, blinking. "You okay?" "I'm fine." He stared for a second. "You sure?" I smiled, tight and calm. "Very sure." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the dining table and made a list. Not groceries, not chores. A list of what I wanted. A room of my own. A front porch swing that was mine again. A kitchen where I wasn't just the help. Peace, dignity, choice. The next morning I met with Mr. Henley again. We moved fast, quietly. I signed the listing papers 2 days later. The house was priced modestly. It was old, but in good shape. Within a week, we had 3 offers. The best one was from a retired couple, moving from out of state. They loved the backyard garden and the sunroom I never got to sit in anymore. By the second week, the deal was in motion, and no one in my house knew a thing. It's strange selling something under the noses of people who think they own it. But it was never theirs, not really. They borrowed it, took it, treated it like a right instead of a gift. I began packing little by little. Not boxes, nothing obvious. Just small things. Jewelry, photo albums, the quilt my mother made, a few pots from the kitchen. I rented a small storage unit under a different name. Every day I made a trip. A handbag full of freedom. I started dressing a little nicer, fixing my hair. I think Greg noticed once or twice, but he didn't say anything. Then came the moment that told me everything I needed to know. One evening, Tanya came into the kitchen and said, "You didn't mop today." I had, just not her way. "Sorry," I said, and started to mop again. As I knelt down, scrubbing the corner under the sink, I felt something twist inside me. Not pain, not anger, something quieter. Like a thread snapping. I stood up, left the mop, walked out onto the porch. I looked at the swing. It was still mine. That night I didn't cry. I wrote instead. Pages and pages in a spiral-bound notebook. Not a letter to them. No, I was done explaining myself. It was a letter to Richard, to the woman I used to be, to the version of me who thought love meant sacrifice without limit. I wasn't that woman anymore. Would you have kept mopping, or would you have stood up too? I didn't tell them until the day the for sale sign went up. It arrived in the early afternoon, carried by a man in jeans and a pressed polo who asked Elaine Whitman. I nodded. He smiled politely. "I'll just put it near the mailbox." He pounded it into the front lawn while Greg mowed the backyard earbuds in. Tanya was upstairs with the baby. No one noticed. Not until dinner. I was setting the table out of habit, not hope, when Greg walked in from the yard. "What the hell is that?" he asked, pointing through the window. Tanya followed a second later, holding her phone. "There's a sign in the yard." I dried my hands on the dish towel. My heart was racing, but my voice was calm. I listed the house. "It's already in contract." Greg stared like I'd slapped him. "What?" "It's mine," I said. "It always was. Your father made sure of it." Tanya's face went pale. "You can't do that without talking to us first." I just did. For a moment the room froze. The children's cartoon hummed faintly from the living room. The soup on the stove bubbled quietly. Greg stepped forward, voice raised. "Where are we supposed to live?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the table. 5 place settings. Mine always at the end next to the wall. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You're both very capable." Tanya's tone sharpened. "You're just doing this to be cruel." "No," I said softly. "I'm doing this because I forgot how to choose myself." Greg clenched his jaw. "You're going to make your grandchildren homeless." That one stung. I loved those babies, still do. But love, I've learned, does not mean lying down and letting yourself be trampled. "I'm not taking their home," I replied. "I'm taking mine back." He swore under his breath. Tanya turned and stormed off. Greg lingered another second, then followed her. They didn't eat the dinner I'd made. I sat alone like always, but that night it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. The next morning the buyers came for a walkthrough. Tanya ignored them. Greg sulked. I showed them around, smiling kindly, answering questions. I stood at the kitchen counter, pointing to the window. "Sun hits just right around 10 a.m., I told them. "If you like tea, this is the spot to drink it." They smiled. The woman touched my hand. "It's a beautiful home." I nodded. It was. By the time closing papers were signed, Greg had stopped talking to me. Tanya had started slamming doors. I didn't react. I just packed. No goodbye dinner, no last family moment, just cardboard and silence. The night before I left, I wrote 2 letters, one for each grandchild. I tucked them into their sock drawers. Inside, I told them stories of when they were babies. How I used to rock them to sleep while singing hymns. How I loved them with everything I had. And how I hoped they'd remember that, even if they didn't understand my leaving right now. I left early the next morning, before sunrise. I placed the house keys on the counter beside the note. "I gave you a home, not a right. This was never yours to take. Be better for your children than you were for your mother." I walked out the door without a sound. No one followed. I didn't look back. I didn't know where I'd go yet, just that I had to go. That freedom isn't always a place. Sometimes it's the absence of permission. If you had the chance to walk away from a house full of silence and take back everything they thought you'd forgotten, would you? I drove with the windows down and the radio low. The air was still cool, laced with the scent of wet grass and that gentle hush only early mornings carry. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing back to a list of chores or checking the time to see if the baby needed feeding. There was no one waiting for me, no calendar pinned to the fridge with Tanya's color-coded demands. Just the road and me. I had the address written on a sticky note in my purse, 118 Finch Hollow near the Ozarks, a cabin Richard and I bought decades ago. Back then, it was a someday place, a weekend escape for retirement that never quite arrived. We hadn't been there since Greg was in college. It was dusty, overgrown, and probably full of squirrels. But it was mine. I pulled into the gravel path just past noon. The grass was high, and the porch had bowed slightly, but the bones were still there. I unlocked the door, the key stiff from disuse. The smell inside was old wood and time, and yet it felt more like home than the house I just left. The first few days were hard. I scrubbed, I patched, I fixed what I could with aging hands and a stubborn heart. I slept under a threadbare quilt and made soup on a rusted stove. My back ached, my knees cracked. But I was smiling, because no one called me the help. No one left sticky notes. No one asked what was for dinner. Every dish I washed was mine. Every chair I sat in was where I chose to sit. I put a wind chime on the front porch, just like the one Richard loved. I planted marigolds along the walkway, even though it was the wrong season. I baked muffins, wrapped them in paper towels, and brought them to the nearest neighbor, a kind widow named Janine. She called me honey and asked if I played cards. I began to feel human again. Sometimes I thought about Greg, about the grandkids, wondered if they missed me or if Tanya had already replaced me with a nanny. I cried once hard while folding a baby blanket I found in my luggage. I almost mailed it back. But then I remembered Tanya's voice-free help, and I folded it into a box instead. A box labeled mine. One night, a letter arrived. It wasn't an apology, just a scribbled note in Greg's hand. I didn't know you felt that way. I wish you had told me sooner. I guess we took too much. No sorry, no thank you, just that. I read it twice and tucked it between the pages of my journal. A week later, the phone rang. It was Greg again. Can we come visit? He asked. I paused. For the kids, he added quickly. They miss you. I said nothing at first. I looked at the trees swaying outside the cabin window. The garden hose still coiled in the grass. My half-knit scarf on the armrest. I need time, I finally said. Time to remember who I was before you stopped seeing me. There was a long silence. I understand, he said, I think. I hung up gently, and then I brewed tea. I sat on the porch swing Richard's swing and let the silence soothe me. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I was just free, and freedom, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just walks out quietly and never looks back. If your home becomes a place where love has to beg to be seen, would you stay? The days blurred into a rhythm I didn't know I'd missed. Wake up with the birds, heat water for tea, sit by the window in an old rocking chair and write letters I never sent. I'd always been the kind of woman who needed to stay busy to feel useful, but here in the cabin, I learned how to be still. And in that stillness, something surprising happened. I started remembering who I was before I became mom grandma, or worse, the help. I was Elaine, I loved crossword puzzles, Elvis records, and red lipstick, even if no one saw it. I used to dance in the kitchen when no one was home. I used to sing in the car. I used to laugh so hard with Richard that we couldn't breathe. I'd buried those parts so deep I thought they were gone. But the silence of the forest has a way of bringing old things back. One morning I found Richard's toolbox in the shed, rusted but still intact. I oiled the hinges and pulled out his hammer. The handle was worn smooth from his hand. I held it tight. That afternoon I fixed the porch step that had been creaking since I arrived. My back ached, but my heart felt steady. And just like that, I stopped feeling like a ghost in someone else's life. I started baking bread again, just one loaf at a time. I brought slices to Janine next door, and we'd sit on her porch playing gin rummy and complaining about our knees. She told me I reminded her of her sister. I told her she reminded me of myself before I got lost. Some nights I watched the sky turn purple and wondered if Greg ever tucked the kids in with the stories I used to tell them. If they asked why Grandma wasn't around anymore. If Tanya still used the phrase, free help. But I didn't wonder bitterly. I wondered like someone watching rain from inside a warm house, safe, dry, and distant. Then one Friday morning I heard a knock. 3 knocks, not loud, not timid. When I opened the door, Greg stood there alone. He looked older than I remembered, not in age, but in weight. His shoulders sagged. His eyes didn't meet mine right away. "Hi, Mom," he said. I didn't reply, just stepped aside. He came in slowly, looking at the walls, the photographs, the table. It was my home and he could feel it. "I was in town," he said. "Thought I'd check in." I nodded. He sat down across from me at the table. There was no food, no tea, just 2 people estranged by silence and memory. I didn't realize, he said, how bad things had gotten. I let the quiet sit between us. I should have listened more, been more. There, I looked at him. My boy, my grown son. The same one I rocked to sleep after nightmares. The same one who once held my hand at the grocery store and asked me to sing while we waited in line. "I didn't want you to listen," I said gently. "I wanted you to see me." He looked down. "I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough, but it was something." I reached across the table, not to comfort him, but to place my hand over his, just for a second. He looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw my son looking back. Not the man with the bills, the stress, the pride. Just Greg. "I'm not ready to come back," I said, "and I don't know if I ever will." He nodded. "I understand." We didn't hug, we didn't cry, but when he left, he paused at the door and whispered, "I love you, Mom." I whispered, "I know." He walked down the path. I watched him go, his figure small, against the tall pines. I didn't feel triumph, I didn't feel revenge. Just a quiet, heavy release, like setting down a burden I'd carried too long. I closed the door, and then I put the kettle on. Would you have opened that door, or would you have let them knock forever? Fall came to the Ozarks with a hush and a blaze. The leaves flared into fire-colored whispers, amber rust crimson. And every morning I'd wake up to a new blanket on the forest floor. The cabin creaked differently in the cold. The mornings were slower but richer. I started wearing Richard's old flannel shirts, layered over my nightgown, and sipping hot cider on the porch. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It healed. I thought of Greg often, not with bitterness, not anymore. More like you think of an old bruise. Something that once throbbed, but now only flickers if touched just right. He didn't call again, but he sent a photo one afternoon, my granddaughter holding a pumpkin, almost her size, grinning with 3 missing teeth. I cried when I saw it, not from sadness, but because I realized something unexpected. They were okay without me, and I was okay without them. That truth wasn't cruel. It was freeing. One day I pulled out my wedding ring from the drawer where I'd hidden it years ago. I slid it onto my finger, not for Richard, not for nostalgia, for myself. To remember that once I was loved deeply and wholly by a man who never let me feel unseen. I wore it as armor, not memory. I started a journal. Each entry began with a question, the kind I wished someone had asked me back when I was folding towels in silence. What brings you joy today, Elaine? What did you say? No to that you used to say yes to just to keep the peace. Whose voice are you finally learning to ignore? What are you no longer apologizing for? They weren't easy questions, but they were mine to answer. Janine helped me paint the porch rails one afternoon, and we got ice cream after like a couple of teenagers. She told me she hadn't laughed that hard in a decade. I told her I hadn't felt that light in 20 years. We're both 70 now, but out here we feel like rebels, survivors of quiet wars. One morning I found a box on my porch. Inside were drawings from the grandkids' crayon heart stick figures. With gray hair, one labeled Grandma's New House. No return address, just love Emily and Peter. I pressed the papers to my heart. I didn't rush to call. I didn't rush to forgive. I just sat and let the love be what it was, uncomplicated, messy, real. A piece of me, not a demand. Sometimes healing doesn't come with an apology or a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a piece of paper, covered in crayon, sitting on a wooden porch where no one expects to be found. That night I made soup. Lentils, carrots, rosemary, just like always. But this time I made it for myself. I lit a candle, sat at the table, one bowl, one spoon, and peace. If you had been me, would you have left sooner? Winter arrived slowly, as if asking permission. The wind changed first, sharper, more insistent. The trees shed their last leaves in surrender, and frost crept across the windows in delicate lace. I wrapped the cabin in wool blankets and silenced my own kind of hibernation. But this time it wasn't lonely. It was sacred. I didn't decorate for Christmas, not out of spite, just simplicity. I made myself cinnamon toast. I listened to old records. I read Little Women again and cried in the same place I always do when Beth dies. And when it snowed, I stood barefoot on the porch and let the cold bite my skin, just to feel alive. On Christmas Eve, I lit a fire in the hearth. Richard built stone by stone. I poured myself a glass of sweet red wine and sat on the rug with a blanket draped over my shoulders. The glow touched every corner of the room, soft, golden, and forgiving. That night I wrote again. Not to Greg, not to the grandkids, to myself. Dear Elaine, I wrote. You did not imagine it. The hurt, the silence, the vanishing. It all happened, but you are not broken. You are becoming. I closed the journal and held it against my chest. Outside the wind howled, but the cabin didn't tremble. I thought about all the years I gave, all the dinners I made, all the times I tucked in, everyone but myself. And for the first time, I didn't feel regret. I felt reclamation. I began volunteering at the local library in January, just a few hours a week, reading to kids, shelving books, drinking terrible coffee with people who didn't expect me to be anything but kind. No performance, no pressure. I made new friends, people who called me Elaine, not Mom or Grandma, or can you do this? One Tuesday I got a card in the mail. No return address, just a child's handwriting on the envelope to Grandma's new house. Inside, Peter had drawn a stick figure with a gray bun, sitting in a chair with books all around her. He wrote, "You look happy. Mommy says you needed a break. I think you're a hero. I read it 3 times, then I placed it on my fridge with the only magnet I kept from the old house. Do no harm, but take no nonsense. By spring, I had planted herbs in tin cans lined along the windowsill, rosemary especially. It reminded me that some things' flavor strength memory can live through anything. I no longer checked my phone hoping for messages. But when they came, I wasn't bitter, just steady. Greg called twice a month. Short updates, calm voices. Tanya didn't speak, but she once sent a picture of the kids baking cookies, their little faces dusted in flour. I smiled at the screen, then went back to kneading my own dough. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't abandonment. It was healing. It was the sound of your own voice unmuted for the first time in years. If you were me, would you forgive them, huh? The thaw came slowly, not just in the soil or the trees, but in me. I didn't notice it at first, not until one morning in early April, when I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about the old house in over a week. The walls, the cold floor tiles, the sound of Tanya's voice drifting down the stairs, they'd faded like fog lifting after a long rain. I was no longer living in reaction to what they did. I was simply living. The cabin had become a place of rhythm. I fixed what needed fixing, rested when I was tired, and learned to take joy in the small. I painted the back fence a pale blue. I baked lemon bread from scratch. I let the screen door slam, sometimes just to hear it echo in the quiet. Then one Sunday morning, as I sat in the sun with a basket of folded laundry, I heard footsteps on the gravel. Emily, my granddaughter. She was taller, older, 9 now, maybe 10. She stood there in overalls and a nervous smile, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom said it was okay to visit, she said softly. My hands shook. I set the basket down. We didn't run into each other's arms. We just looked, studied. And then slowly she stepped forward and hugged me, not with hesitation but certainty. Inside I made tea. She didn't want any, said she liked lemonade better. So I stirred sugar and lemon into cold water while she sat at the table, legs swinging. I like your house, she said. It smells like books. I laughed. She looked around and then whispered, Peter says you're like a wizard, that you disappeared and made your own magic place. I blinked hard, swallowing something tender. We spent the afternoon walking the path behind the cabin. She picked dandelions. I told her stories about her father when he was her age, how he used to pretend to be a pirate, how he once covered our kitchen in flour, trying to make pancakes for me on Mother's Day. She laughed. Dad did that. I nodded. Your dad loved me once very deeply. I think he forgot for a little while, but that's okay. She looked up at me. Do you still love him? Always, I said. Loving someone doesn't mean you stay where they hurt you. It just means you wish better for them than they ever gave you. She took my hand. That night she slept in the guest room, the one I'd fixed up with quilts and books, and a little lamp shaped like a moon. She left the door open. I stood in the hallway and watched her breathe, her small chest rising and falling like peace come to life. When Greg picked her up the next morning, he looked different. Humble, quiet. He didn't come inside, just nodded and said, Thank you, Mom. I nodded back. No apologies, no begging, no pretending, just space and something close to grace. After they drove off, I stood on the porch a long while. I didn't feel triumphant or lonely. I just felt right. That's what healing does. It doesn't shout or slam doors. It just sits beside you one day while you drink your coffee and says, You're home now. Would you have let your granddaughter in? Would you have told her the truth in a way that didn't hurt? By the time summer came around, the garden had taken root in ways I hadn't expected. The rosemary thrived in its sun-warmed pot beside the porch steps. The tomatoes burst red and fat, and I learned to string them up along the wooden posts like beads on a necklace. Even the wildflowers I hadn't planted came back bold yellow things, with no name swaying like they'd always belonged. Sometimes I wondered if I had too. I spent those golden days barefoot more often than not. The earth was warm, forgiving. My hands grew calloused again, but it wasn't from folding laundry or scrubbing floors. It was from building, choosing, creating, and from letting go. I took a class at the local community center, Writing Your Personal Legacy. Just 3 other women, all widows, all carrying their own kind of silence. We sat in a sunlit room and read our stories out loud 1 page at a time. When I shared mine about the house, the silence, the decision to leave the room went still. One woman, her name was Margaret, reached across the table and touched my hand. "You were brave," she said. "A lot of us just stayed." I nodded, not because I felt proud, but because I understood. Staying is its own kind of pain. So is leaving. Neither makes you a villain or a saint. They just make you human. Emily came again in July, this time with Peter. They brought cookies store-bought, but the gesture was their own. Tanya had let them decorate the container with glitter glue and stickers. I helped, Peter said proudly. I didn't even spill. We sat on the porch. I told them stories, and they told me about their new puppy. When the sun began to set, Emily turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever come back to the old house?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "That house isn't mine anymore, and that's okay. Some places are meant to hold a chapter, not the whole book." Peter asked if they could stay the night. I said yes. We made grilled cheese and tomato soup. They laughed when I spilled pepper all over the counter and called myself a kitchen disaster. Emily looked at me, then seriously, softly. "You're not gone, Grandma," she said. "You just moved your story somewhere better." That night, after they'd fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea. I opened the last page and wrote something I never expected to write. I forgive them. I forgive Greg for forgetting who I was. I forgive Tanya for seeing me as a tool instead of a person. I forgive myself for staying so long and for leaving when I did. I forgive because I want peace more than I want apologies. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was whole. Tell me honestly, would you have forgiven them? August came hot and slow, curling the edges of the leaves before fall could claim them. The air grew heavier, but I moved through it with ease. I knew now when to rest, when to say no, when to put the kettle on instead of pushing through. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not handwritten like the children's, but typed neatly sealed in a cream envelope. Inside was a formal invitation. "We're having a small family gathering," it read. "Emily and Peter wanted you to be there. No expectations, just food, laughter, and a chance to see them with everyone." At the bottom, Greg had signed his name, and beside it, in a different pen, a single sentence. "You will always have a place if you want one." I held that note for a long time. My hands trembled not with anger, but with the weight of possibility. A year ago, I might have torn it up. 6 months ago, I would have ignored it. But now I simply folded it and set it on the windowsill. I didn't need to decide right away, because the difference between being forgotten and being remembered is choice. And I finally had that again. That weekend, I harvested basil from the garden and made pesto. I taught myself to knit cables. I reread a letter Richard once wrote me in our first year of marriage. It was yellowed and soft, the ink beginning to fade. But the words still lived. "You are not a background to someone else's life, Elaine. You are the story." He knew, even then. I sat with those words for hours, and I thought maybe all those years I thought I was losing myself. I was really just learning how deep my roots went. Because even when they paved over me with expectations and silence, I never stopped growing. I just grew inward, quietly, like a tree waiting for spring. When I called Greg 2 days later, his voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd answer." "I'm not angry," I said. "I know, but I wouldn't blame you if you were." "I'm not coming to be part of your routine again," I said gently. "But I will come for the kids and for the truth." The line was quiet for a moment. "Then that's more than I deserve." "Maybe," I said, "but it's exactly what I deserve to choose what I carry." The gathering was quiet, modest. Tanya nodded at me, kept her distance. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for her. Emily ran up first, arms flung wide. Peter followed, cheeks red from chasing bubbles. Greg hovered nearby, awkward, unsure. I sat in the yard under an old maple tree with a paper plate of barbecue and lemonade. The kids sat beside me. Greg eventually came too. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a reunion. It was something better. It was real. I stayed an hour, long enough to remind them I still loved them, not long enough to start folding napkins. On the drive home, I rolled the windows down and let the wind tangle my hair. The road bent and curved back toward the place I now called mine. When I pulled into the gravel drive, the porch light clicked on automatically. Home. No shouts, no orders, no cold silence. Just the soft creak of the swing as I sat down and exhaled. If they never change, I'll be okay. Because I already have. Tell me, could you walk into a room that once broke you and still keep your peace? September arrived like a whispered apology. Cooler mornings, golden skies, a hush in the trees, as if the world itself was taking a breath. I could feel the shift, not just in the seasons, but in me. I moved through the days differently now, lighter, unafraid. One quiet Sunday, I pulled out a large cream envelope and my nicest stationery, not because I owed anyone anything, but because I had something left to say. I wrote to Greg, not to scold, not to reopen old wounds, but to leave clarity behind in case I didn't get the chance to speak it out loud again. "You are still my son," I wrote. "Even when you forgot who I was, I never stopped remembering you. But motherhood is not servanthood. Love is not labor. I gave everything I had, not because you earned it, but because I wanted to. And one day I needed to want something for myself. I hope you teach your children the difference." I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer it like a reward. I simply told the truth. And then I mailed the letter. The next day I sat outside with my knitting in my lap, the air crisp and sweet. The sky was clear and the wind danced through the trees. Janine came by with apple turnovers wrapped in a dish towel, and we sat on the porch, two older women with aching knees and fuller hearts. "You ever think about what it would have been like if they had appreciated you more?" she asked suddenly. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No," I said, "because if they had, I might have stayed, and I never would have found this peace." She nodded slowly. "That's the hardest kind of gift to give yourself. Freedom." "No," she smiled. "The permission to live without guilt." We ate turnovers and watched the sun slip behind the trees. That evening I lit a candle and took out my journal. I didn't write much, just one sentence. "I am no longer waiting to be remembered by the people who forgot me." I closed the cover and whispered it aloud, and that was enough. A week later, another letter arrived. This one in Tanya's handwriting, short, stiff, but sincere. "I know we didn't treat you right." I didn't see it until the kids started asking why Grandma left. I couldn't give them a good answer. "I hope someday you'll come back, not to stay, just to visit, just so they know what love with boundaries looks like. I stared at that line for a long time. Love with boundaries. Maybe she was learning too. Maybe the softest revenge was simply choosing yourself and showing others what it looked like when you did. If you had the chance to teach someone how to love better by stepping away, would you take it? October swept in with a rustle and a sigh. The leaves turned copper and scarlet, and the cabin seemed to lean into the season like an old friend settling into a favorite chair. I pulled out the wool blankets, lit the fireplace in the evenings, wore Richard's old flannel robe, and let the silence wrap around me like something earned. One morning I woke to the scent of smoke, not danger, just someone nearby burning leaves. The world outside was cloaked in fog, and for a moment I felt like I was the last person left on earth. But I wasn't lonely. I was finally whole. That same day, Emily sent a letter, not Tanya, not Greg, just Emily in her rounded handwriting, with hearts above every I. Grandma, guess what it said? I told my teacher that when I grow up, I want to be like you. I want to live in the woods and have a garden and drink tea and not let people push me around. At the bottom, she wrote, P.S. I know why you left. I think you're brave. I pressed the letter to my chest and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I finally knew that what I did wasn't just for me. It was for her too, for all of them. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave. So they learn what your silence really meant. So they grow up understanding the cost of taking someone for granted. So they know that love has a spine and dignity wears an apron just as proudly as armor. I wrote Emily back, told her that bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like packing a suitcase with trembling hands. Sometimes it's setting a dinner table for one and still lighting the candle. Sometimes it's walking away and never raising your voice, only your standards. Later that month, I took a trip. Nothing big, just a drive through the old state roads Richard and I used to explore. I stopped at an antique store, bought a scarf I didn't need, laughed with a stranger at a gas station when I spilled coffee on myself. It felt good to exist without anyone needing me to do anything. When I came home, the cabin smelled like rosemary and fresh air. I stood on the porch looking at the swing. A year ago, I'd sat on it as a woman unraveling. Now I sat as someone sewn back together by her own hands. Greg called again in late October. His voice was softer this time, measured. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? For not raising your voice when we deserved it. For walking away instead of screaming. For showing me what it means to own your life. I didn't say much. Sometimes you don't need to. Sometimes silence speaks loud enough. He ended the call with, I'm trying to be better. And for the first time, I believed him. Would you believe someone who once used your kindness as currency? Could you? The first frost came early in November. I woke to a silvery hush outside grass, stiff with ice crystals, the windows dusted with breathy patterns. The woods behind the cabin stood still as if even the trees were holding their breath. I wrapped myself in Richard's old sweater and stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold bite at my cheeks. It didn't chase me inside, it braced me. Winter no longer frightened me. I made tea and opened the notebook again, the one where I'd chronicled this quiet, stubborn transformation. Page after page of reflections, questions, truths. I used to be too afraid to speak. That morning, I added a new entry. You don't have to be cruel to protect yourself. You just have to be clear, and brave enough to be alone if that's the price of peace. Later that week, Janine invited me to Thanksgiving at her house. I brought stuffing and a cranberry pie and sat beside people who knew nothing about my past just that I was kind and could tell a great story and knew how to make the gravy smooth. We clinked glasses and gave thanks, not because life was perfect, but because we had survived it. That night back at the cabin, I lit a single candle and placed it by the window. Not for anyone in particular, just for me. A symbol, a reminder that even the smallest light, when lit with intention, can fill an entire room. The next day, a package arrived on my porch. No note, just a plain brown box with a child's handwriting scribbled across the top. Grandma's swing kit, so you can build one for us too. Inside were ropes, wooden planks, and a photo of Emily and Peter sitting on a tire swing, their arms wrapped around each other grinning. I traced the edges of the photo heart, thudding softly in my chest. Maybe one day I thought I'd build that swing. Maybe not for them, but with them, if they earned it, because I was no longer giving away pieces of myself just because someone called me Mom or Grandma. Those titles didn't entitle anyone to my silence, my labor, or my love. They had to be earned, and that was what changed everything. Later that night, I walked down the path behind the cabin, the same one Richard and I used to hike when we were younger. The stars were sharp and bright above the treetops, and the wind sang through the branches like memory. I stood there a long time, and then I whispered, "I forgive you, but I will never forget what it taught me." I meant it. The lesson wasn't in the pain, it was in the rising. Would you build that swing, or would you keep it as a symbol of the line you finally drew? The last leaves clung to the trees as December rolled, in stubborn golden curling inward like pages at the end of a well-read book. I sat by the window most mornings now, a quilt over my knees, a mug of tea in hand, and peace nestled deep in my chest like a warm coal, not blazing, not dramatic, just steady. One morning, I reread the first entry in my journal, the day I stirred soup for a table that never filled. I remembered how I stood there holding a ladle, like it was a question I didn't know how to answer. I remembered the ache of waiting to be seen, the silence that followed me room to room. But I didn't feel that ache anymore. Now I cooked for myself, set one bowl, lit one candle. Not because I was lonely, but because I'd learned that solitude and sorrow aren't the same. That week I received a letter from Greg, a real one this time, handwritten, no cross-outs or rushed scribbles. The envelope smelled faintly of cologne, and the paper was thick as if he'd chosen it on purpose. Inside it read, "I still don't know how I missed it, Mom. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I got so used to you being there, I forgot to see the person inside the role. You gave everything, and I treated it like nothing. I want to change that, not with promises, but with presence. If you ever feel ready, I'd love for you to visit again. No expectations, no chores, just you, just us." He ended it with something simple. "I miss you." I sat there a long time, the letter in my lap, tears resting just behind my eyes but not falling. I wasn't rushing to answer, but something inside me softened. Not because I needed to go back, but because I knew I didn't have to. That was the power now, the choice. A few days later, I took the kids' swing kit out of the box. It was a bright afternoon, the kind where the sky feels impossibly wide and the wind carries memories instead of chill. I sanded the wood, measured the knots, hung it from the old oak behind the cabin. I didn't text them about it, didn't invite anyone. I just sat on the swing once it was done, my legs barely brushing the ground, and smiled. It wasn't for anyone else, it was for me. For the part of me that needed to know I could build again something beautiful, something joyful, something not born from pain. And I thought maybe healing isn't an event. Maybe it's 1,000 small acts of reclamation. lighting a candle, stirring your own soup, planting rosemary, hanging a swing. Maybe it's just this remembering that your life still belongs to you. Would you hang the swing? Would you sit in it first? Or would you wait for someone to tell you it was okay? The snow fell quietly on Christmas Eve. Fat, lazy flakes tumbling from a sky, the color of smoke coating the cabin roof and wrapping the forest in a hush so complete it felt sacred. I had the fireplace lit, the scent of cinnamon rising from a simmering pot on the stove. Outside, the swing swayed just slightly in the breeze, collecting a soft blanket of white. I stood at the window, hands cradling my tea, watching the world become new again. A knock broke the silence, soft, hesitant. When I opened the door, Emily stood there bundled in a blue puffer coat, cheeks pink, eyes bright. Behind her, Greg. "No, Tanya." "Hi, Grandma," Emily said, holding up a small, neatly wrapped box. "Dad drove me all the way here, just us." Greg gave a quiet nod. She asked, "I just drove." I looked at them, my granddaughter glowing with hope, my son carrying the weight of what he nearly lost. I stepped aside. They entered slowly. Emily unzipped her coat, bounced on her heels, looked around like the place held magic. "It smells like Christmas here," she said. I smiled and lit a second candle. Greg stayed near the door, uncertain. "I didn't come to take anything from you," he said. "I just wanted to see where you ended up." I handed him a mug of tea. "It's not about where I ended up," I said. "It's about who I found along the way." He looked down, then back up at me. I see her now. The woman who kept everything running while I ignored the cost. The woman who deserved more than thanks whispered over dishes. He swallowed. "You didn't deserve what we did to you." I didn't say anything, because sometimes silence is kinder than words. Emily opened her gift, a knitted scarf in soft purples and greens, her favorite colors. She hugged it tight, then wrapped it around both our necks and grinned. "Now we're stuck together," she said. Later, I gave them dinner, rosemary stew cornbread, and a slice of apple pie I made just in case. Greg helped with the dishes without being asked. They left after sunset. No promises, no tears, just a hug and a whispered, "Thank you, Mom." After the door closed, I sat by the fire and let the quiet return. Not the kind of quiet that bruises, but the kind that soothes. The kind that holds space for everything. The woman I once was, the woman I had to become. The ones who finally saw the difference. And as the snow fell gently into the night, I whispered to the flames, "I'm home." If you had taken everything back, not out of vengeance, but out of love for yourself, what would you have done next? Spring returned as if nothing had happened. The snow melted into the earth without ceremony. Buds appeared on the trees, small and stubborn. Birds filled the air, again flitting between branches, reminding me that life insists on continuing, even when we're not looking. And me, I didn't just survive what happened, I reclaimed it. I was no longer the woman waiting by the stove soup, gently bubbling heart clenched in silence. I was no longer folding laundry in a room that was no longer mine. I was not the background character in my own life. I was the story, and I had written my ending differently. The house I left, they live in it now. Greg and Tanya, I hear from the kids now and then. Peter sends me drawings, dinosaurs mostly. Emily emails sometimes. She's growing into herself, brave and soft, all at once. And Greg, we're not best friends. We're not pretending everything is perfect. But he sends letters now. Not long ones, but thoughtful. There's a kind of reverence in his tone, like he's still learning how to speak to me without asking something from me. I let him, because that's what boundaries are. Not walls, but doors. Ones you get to open or close. Ones you own. I spend my days in a life I built from the ashes of what they took. Not grand, but honest. There are quiet mornings on the porch, hikes through the trees where I hum songs from my childhood, fresh pie cooling on the windowsill, rosemary always blooming in its little ceramic pot. The swing still hangs behind the cabin. Some days I sit in it. Some days I just watch it move in the wind. Not everything needs to be used to be loved. I don't miss the past. Because the past was a version of me that didn't know what she deserved. And now I do. So now the days come and go without urgency. I rise when the sun filters through the trees. I make my tea, slowly holding the mug in both hands, letting its warmth anchor me to the present. The birds sing like they've always known peace. The porch swing creaks gently, even when no one sits in it. And that's okay. Not everything needs a witness to have value. There's something remarkable about quiet happiness, the kind that doesn't demand applause. I don't need to be anyone's hero, anyone's savior, or even anyone's memory. I just need to be me. Elaine, the woman who left when it was hardest, the woman who took everything back, not out of bitterness, but out of love for herself. Some days I still think of the house I left behind. The walls I scrubbed, the floors. I swept the silence I endured. But those thoughts don't weigh me down anymore. They rise like dust motes in morning light, seen acknowledged and left to drift away. If you're standing in a kitchen waiting to be heard, if you've handed over your space, your voice, your worth in the name of love, please remember, you can take it back, not with rage, but with grace, not with screams, but with stillness. And when you do, the world may not cheer, but your soul will exhale. And that's more than enough. So here's to us, the quiet ones, the ones who left without slamming doors, the ones who drew their line, not with anger, but with resolve. We didn't disappear. We came home, to ourselves.